One of the biggest and thorniest stories of the pandemic has been the shocking increase in crime, especially murders.
It's been a year of brazen violence nationwide. 23 shot, including 3 killed outside a nightclub in Florida. A man opens fire at a convenience store in Washington. And in Philadelphia, a shooter in a car fires on a group. 6 were shot, 1 died.
Like everyone I know in Philadelphia, I am outraged by this.
Over 400 people have been killed in Philadelphia this year alone.
What can we do to prevent the next murder by gun?
The murder rate soared in 2020, up 30%, the largest increase ever. Cities like Memphis, Milwaukee, and Des Moines all set records.
The largest increase in murder ever. Now, Jacobin's new issue is dedicated to the issue of crime and how we on the left should think about a topic that is typically fertile ground for the right. A lot of liberals and even leftists have been skeptical about the crime wave, but the numbers seem undeniable. As Benjamin Fogel, who guest edited the issue, notes in his introduction, quote, last year, 21,570 people were murdered in the United States, the largest single year surge in the country's history, and an increase of 4,901 killings from 2019. Last year also saw the highest number of gun deaths in history. The overwhelming majority of these deaths were concentrated in America's poorest and most racially segregated neighborhoods. It's not surprising that commentators are speculating about whether we're set for a return to the bad old days of the 1980s and 90s. You mean the bad old days when McGruff the crime dog was taking a bite out of crime?
Yes?
Special delivery.
Hold it. I'm McGruff, the crime dog. This was Detroit 2 years ago. John Petros was wounded, the crook got away, and the crime business was booming.
I couldn't afford to leave, and I didn't want to leave.
We might want to patrol up and down the alley.
So John and his neighbors fought back.
So everyone understand your assignment for this evening?
Together with the cops, they formed a neighborhood watch program. That's John and his neighbor Walter today on CB patrol. When they spot a suspect, they call the cops, and the cops are on their way. Hey, that's pretty fast, guys. Since this neighborhood program began, crime in John's neighborhood dropped 50% and property values doubled.
We made a difference.
And you can too.
So find out more. Take a bite out of crime.
Take a bite out of crime. Man, I remember those commercials so well. If you don't know about McGruff, the crime dog, please check out his album of anti-drug songs for children from the year 1986. You will not be disappointed. But as Benjamin Fogel notes, while the overall crime rate is down from the 1990s levels, the murder rate is up. And crucially, people's perception is that crime is way up. Quote, Americans believe that crime is getting worse. A 2020 Gallup poll found that 78% thought crime had increased over the course of that year, the highest number recorded since 1993. It is hard not to see the election of figures like Eric Adams as New York mayor as not, at least in part, driven by crime concerns. In the run-up to his election, one survey found that 46% of likely voters said crime or violence is a main problem in New York today. Understanding the root causes of crime is crucial to combating the politics of crime, which, like I said, is typically fertile ground for the right. The first thing to acknowledge is the staggering levels of violence in the United States. As Adana Usmani points out, quote, despite the decline of crime in recent decades, the United States remains an extraordinarily violent place. It is still the most violent society in the developed world, and by far. Almost 13,500 people were murdered in 2015, of which more than half were African American. Black men in the United States face El Salvador-level murder rates. Now, the question is, why? Well, one obvious answer is the sheer number of guns in the United States, which is unrivaled in the developed world. There are 120 guns for every 100 residents in America, and I'm no math whiz, but that comes out to more guns than people. The presence of a gun makes any confrontation or disagreement a potentially deadly one. But while the presence of massive amounts of guns explains the United States' violence vis-a-vis the rest of the world, it doesn't explain the fluctuations of violence within the United States. The right tends to blame violent crime on culture, as in rap music and baggy clothes make black people more violent than nice whites. That's obviously nonsense. On the left, broadly speaking, we believe that violent crime stems from social oppression. The thing is that the violent crime wave began rising dramatically in the 1960s, which is generally seen as an era of ascendant social democracy, with civil rights passing and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Right-wingers point out that it was all that lefty gobbledygook that led to the rise in crime, but is that true? To get to the answer, we have to look a little deeper. According to Adana Usmani, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Harvard, the rise in crime was real, and it was driven by social oppression. He writes, quote, "Our view is that to understand the reasons for the rise in violence to exceptional levels, one has to understand certain exceptional facts about American economic development. We all know that America's industrial boom is a story of the late 19th and early 20th century. Industry in the United States was taking off, with America becoming an economic power in the world. Key to our story is the observation that in the United States, this process unfolds differently than it does elsewhere. European countries all industrialized with their own peasantries. But in the United States, the peasantry was locked in the Jim Crow South in the plantation economy. They didn't migrate north in large numbers to take those jobs. Plantation owners were adamant that they stay. So the booming industries in the North sought labor where they could find it, Italian and Polish immigrants and whoever else. The reason this is so important to the story of crime is that it is at the heart of the labor market difficulties that African Americans confront once they do later migrate to American cities. Jobs from the first wave of industrialization didn't employ African Americans in substantial numbers. Once Jim Crow collapsed and African Americans finally came to the North in large numbers, those jobs had begun to disappear. What's more, African Americans arrived in cities and labor markets in which European immigrants had already established themselves and in which they used America's highly local institutions to hoard jobs, housing, access to schooling, and other scarce resources. So basically, the rise in crime and the subsequent crackdown that led to mass incarceration is a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, but not in the way the popular narrative thinks it is. Basically, by the time Jim Crow was being dismantled and African Americans migrated in great numbers, not just to the northern industrialized cities, but off the southern countryside and into the southern cities, the jobs were almost all gone. Because America locked its black underclass to work in the land in the American South, it needed to import workers from places like Ireland and Italy to feed its growing industrial might. They then gobbled up the jobs and left black people displaced in ghettos in the major cities, which led to the kind of desperation and social alienation that leads to crime. And if you fast forward to today, you see that the coronavirus pandemic has slammed poorer neighborhoods.
Most of our patients are poor. Most of our patients live in health deserts. Most are uninsured or underinsured. Most are unemployed and have other disproportionate impact, what we call social determinants of health.
Here in Washington and elsewhere across the country, high-quality primary and preemptive care can often be absent and unaffordable in poorer neighborhoods and communities.
The economic impact has been brutal and unequal. According to a study by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, quote, minorities were hit harder by the pandemic, largely due to an industry occupation composition effect. For example, their disproportionate presence in service industries, the leisure and hospitality industry, and the other services industry. Urban areas, especially city centers, were hit the hardest, and the effects still remain. And it's been urban areas, especially the city centers, where the murder rate has skyrocketed, and the victims are often poor, Black and brown people.
Khalil Akori's 19-year-old son, Wanye, dreamed of becoming a journalist. In his free time, he loved playing basketball in their Minneapolis neighborhood.
That's kind of how, my neighborhood got to know us. I was the mother, the single mother with 5, and the boys outside playing basketball.
On October 11th, Corey got a text from Wanye saying he was heading home after playing at a nearby court.
It was my middle child's birthday. He was turning 12. And later on that day, we were going to celebrate at home like we do. We were waiting for Wanye to come. When he didn't come, it was devastating.
Wanye had been killed in a drive-by shooting. Minneapolis, still reeling from this summer's police killing of George Floyd, has had 80 murders so far this year, a level not seen since the 1990s. Despite the uptick, the Minneapolis City Council voted unanimously earlier this month to shift nearly $8 million from next year's police budget. I spoke with Corey, who's an early education teacher, by Skype.
I mean, what do you think happened?
I don't even know. I mean, just from what I'm hearing from, like, you know, the police, like, mistaken identity. Like, what happened to him is unexplainable. They don't have any leads.
Tragically, Kalila Corey has felt this pain before. She grew up on Chicago's West Side and lost 2 brothers to gun violence. She says she moved her family to Minneapolis 6 years ago in hopes of giving her children a better life.
So it's more trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And I don't want my kids to live in fear.
So the question becomes, what is the solution? Well, definitely we need to try to do something about guns, although the practicality of getting the hundreds of millions of weapons off the street is daunting, to say the least. But we also need, broadly speaking, actual social democracy in this country that is evenly distributed across the entire population. A real social safety net that provides security for people and services that can provide healthcare, jobs, and an ability to live a secure, comfortable life. So why do politicians not do that? Why is the response to crime always more punitive state violence? Well, the short answer is that it's cheaper. According to Adana Usmani, again, quote, arresting, sentencing, and imprisoning criminal offenders is far cheaper than social democracy. Even today, in the meager American welfare state, the money spent on punitive institutions is far exceeded by the money spent on social programs. Over the last 3 decades, state and local governments have spent only about 4% of their total outlay on police and 3% on prisons. At the federal level, these numbers were vanishingly small, roughly 0.5% and 0.2% respectively. In 2014, for every dollar spent on police, prisons, and the court system, the government at all levels spent more than 12 on social programs. Okay, so it's expensive, but it definitely seems worth it. Social democracy is great. Well, here's a donor. The reason why this doesn't happen is because in a capitalist society, revenue is in the hands of the rich. Politicians are hesitant to tax elites since taxation threatens investment, and any threat to investment is a threat to economic stability. Where they have done so, it is generally because disruptive mass movements of ordinary people have forced their hands. The movements of the 1930s and 1960s dragged social democratic demands into the American mainstream and won several important concessions. But by the end of the 1960s, neither the political nor economic signs were propitious. The civil rights movement had crested a few years earlier. Its left-wing elements were trying, but failing, to craft a strategy to take the struggle to the northern ghettos and black working class. The labor movement was large but ossified. Meanwhile, crucially, the profit rate had fallen from its peak, and imperialist adventures in Vietnam had drained the state's exchequer, or coffers, I guess, in the American parlance. Investment was slowing. In this inhospitable soil, social democracy could not take root. So instead of social democracy, we got mass incarceration. Now, we should be clear-eyed about the real effects of crime, especially on the working class. There is an instinct to say that this is all manufactured outrage pushed by Fox News, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Poor people definitely suffer from crime, as they do from poverty. To fix crime, we need to fix poverty. And to do that, we need to massively redistribute the wealth and power in this country from the few to the many.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's daunting what's in front of us in order to tackle this. But it seems like the worst response possible that the left could have is to just say it's not a problem. That like even if we think, even if like we have the data and we can say, in fact, it's not a problem, even if for some, if that was true, and I think the data actually shows that there is a real problem, but even if that was true, why would we say to these people that we want to bring into our political coalition, yeah, your issues don't really matter to us. What you think and what you feel doesn't really matter. Like, it is the most tone deaf possible response to this problem.
You see that's a latent sync, not just on this issue, but on a lot of issues. I find it's like, you know, your concerns are not important, or they're fake, or they're a right-wing conspiracy, or whatever. This happens not just with this issue, but with a lot of issues, and it's always kind of maddening when you see that. Like, you have to, to convince people, you kind of have to you absorb like their concerns, and then try best you can to channel their concerns into something productive.
Yeah, and the problem is that liberals cannot address this problem because, like you're saying, like what Adonner's saying at the end of the piece, and it's the fact that the real problem here is the fact that mass incarceration is cheaper, and capitalists, the ruling class in this country, the people who actually own all the stuff and make the investment decisions, and therefore have a great deal of power over politicians to tell them what to spend on, what not to spend on, whether or not budgets are going to increase or not. They don't want social democracy. They don't want the spending. They obviously don't want the power that it would give to working people. And so all of these liberal solutions that are mostly focused on change people's culture, or some kind of community uplift program where we're going to empower people and make them feel better about the fact that they live in poverty without actually getting rid of the actual poverty in these situations. It cannot deal with the problem, and you're going to continue to get these horrific, violent outcomes, especially in inner cities.
Yeah, I mean, I also I didn't include it in the piece, but like Donner's point about how white flight from the American cities basically collapsed the tax base for local politicians starting in the 1950s and into the 1960s is a point that, like, once you hear it, you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, these politicians that ran the cities all of a sudden have their tax base kind of removed, and they have to deal with the effects of crime. So, like, what do they do if they can't tax? Because all the rich people have gone out to the suburbs, which have their own, local institutions, and they tax themselves in those districts. What are they going to do? Well, the solution seems obvious. It's like you just ramp up the carceral state because it's so cheap.
Right. Yeah, and crucially, like, the explanation for the carceral state, when it is connected to white flight, the explanation is, oh, well, it's because of racism, that it's because white people in America, in fact, want to, punish Black people, across the board, and that this was all intentional, that there was like a conscious effort to install this situation. But it's just clearly not the case that, like, if people are in fact moving out to the suburbs, whites, urbanites are now becoming suburbanites because of the fact that they happen to be the ones who, because of Jim Crow, because like there is a historical legacy, have greater resources and income and can do that. Then the not so conscious, the actual just kind of like objective reality is that then capital calls the shots more when you have a lower tax base for the state. The state cannot coerce the business owners because they have nothing, they have no leverage. They have nothing that they can do to tell these corporations, pay your fair share so that we can like have proper infrastructure and high employment.
Haven't these people watched Who Framed Roger Rabbit? It wasn't the racists. I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of racists who did white flight, but it was a conspiracy between the auto manufacturers and the tire companies to create the American suburb. America's the only country that has cities with these like fucking giant suburbs. In all the other countries in the developed world, the desirable place to live is in the city center, not in the outskirts of the city. In the outskirts of the city traditionally is where the working class lived. America has it completely backwards, and it's because of Roger Rabbit. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the movie.
It's one of my favorite movies, and the economics
it's the best
went over my head as a child. So.
Yeah, I had no idea what that's the trick, is you make the villain so just scary that the actual scheme doesn't matter, because Christopher Lloyd in that movie was absolutely terrifying when I was a kid, and I had no idea about it's like Trading Places. Like, no one knows what the scheme is in Trading Places, but it doesn't matter because the movie just works. But yeah, the other movie that kind of explains this phenomenon is, for lack of a better term, and I don't want to turn this into a Joker-fied stream, but is The Joker. The Joker actually does get at this. The politics of the Joker are pretty spot on.
This show has been Jokerfied, Nando.
It's been Jokerfied. Yeah, I know. If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.